Welcome to Fortune Forecast. I am Daisy, your hostess, and you are in my book playlist. In this video, we will be continuing with the reading of the book titled The Psychic Life of Jesus, written by Rev G. Maurice Elliott, published by the Spiritualist Press in 1938. I'm going to jump right into my narrator's comments. If you want to move forward, go to the description and click on the timestamp. I won't be long. In these last few chapters, there was a main theme where I feel that the author was trying to explain that while we may be calling all these things miracles, that healing that Jesus was performing, the exorcism that he was performing, one of the things that we need to keep in mind was, and foremost, Jesus said, "He that believeth on me, the works that I do, shall he do also, and greater works than these shall he do." And that is from the book of John, chapter 14, verse 12. And along with this, the author took us through the process, revealing to us that the master healer was also the master teacher. He clearly demonstrated that you needed preparation for this process. You needed to ensure that your patient or the person had expectant faith, a faith that was necessary for the foundation of the miracle, which now the author was just saying it is normal when you have faith. And there were also some elements that were important in making sure that the conditions were ready. If the heart was heavy, it needed forgiveness of itself. In other situations, he talked about what was needed was the removal of this quote-unquote sin. And sin in itself, or the devil in itself, could be the spirit of, in essence, the spirit of fear, the spirit of doubt, the spirit of anger, whatever it is that's weighing this person down. In its sense, that must be addressed. So when we hear this author talk about the psychic life of Jesus, for me, it is providing me a better understanding of the mind of Jesus as dealing with others. This gives us a window to consider the amazing knowledge. And we're not talking about wisdom, because wisdom is something much deeper, but the knowledge that Jesus had in the area of astrology, astronomy, mental psych, the human body. This is not only with understanding that for those that believe in God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, in this one being, having to be confined in the flesh of man. What a challenge indeed. And using that as a premise, can you imagine what a better way to understand your children when you have been in the flesh and demonstrated how to move forward in this flesh and demonstrate the challenges, the pains, and the things that we must have the steadfastness to overcome. Indeed, a great God indeed. On that note, we'll move on to chapter 17. The earthly ministry of Jesus is now drawing to a close. He has nearly finished teaching the 12 apostles. He has nearly done all that he could by living. His work is now to die and come back from the dead. Jesus could not give the 12 the more advanced teaching because of the limited capacity of their minds. There were many things he would like to have taught them, but they would not have understood. The more advanced teaching they would have to learn by the experience of his death and his return from the dead. He did, however, try to teach them that their mission was not, like his own, confined to Israel. This he did by a kind of parable. The Jews believed that there were 70 nations of mankind. So Jesus now chose 70 disciples whom he sent out as missionaries to every city and place which he was going to visit on his way to Jerusalem. And in order to show that he wanted his followers to do the works that he did and go to all nations and all men, he told them that the harvest was great, but the laborers were few. What were the 70 to do when they entered a city or a place? They were first to heal the sick and then to instruct them in the teaching of Jesus. Neither the 12 nor the 70 were commissioned to preach only. They were commissioned to heal and to preach. A church that does not heal the sick is in no true sense a Christian church. When the 70 returned from their missionary journey, they told Jesus how delighted they were to find that even the devils obeyed them. They could cast them out. In the New Testament, the casting out of devils is regarded as a greater work of power than any other form of healing. And surely it is. In ordinary cases of sickness and disease, one is dealing with something far less personal than obsession by a spirit. Granted that some forms of sickness and disease are due to the influences of evil spirits, yet the difference between these influences and obsession is as great as that between a besieged citadel and a captured citadel. When the enemy is in occupation, he is controlling all the key positions, and it is extremely difficult to dislodge him. But the church does not really believe in obsession and dismisses the subject with such sentence as, "The world, Jewish and pagan, seems to have lived in perpetual fear of imaginary demons." The attitude of Jesus towards demonical possession must be explained as a gracious accommodation to the views of the age. If the church really believed in obsession, she would send her exorcist to our asylums and wherever the afflicted were. But she has no exorcists, and mediums are an anathema to her. The day is fast coming when the church will make the discovery that Jesus was right. The 12 and the 70 right, Dr. Carl Wickland right, spiritualists right, and she herself wrong. The primate of that day will not broadcast a recall to religion, but a recall to spiritualism. But, as Ernest Oaten said when he gave evidence before the Archbishop's Committee, it will not be an easy for spiritualists to forget that the church waited till the battle was won before she declared herself. My readers will be interested to hear what Dr. Carl Wickland recently said at a meeting held under the auspices of the World Service Group. "I always been anxious to obtain evidence," said the doctor, "which would convince my medical brothers that obsession is a fact. It is not the only cause of insanity or mental derangement, but it is a frequent cause, and the evidence I have been able to put on record with the help of my wife's wonderful mediumship puts that beyond doubt. Mrs. Wickland has never taken harm, mentally or physically, from being controlled by the obsessing spirits dislodged from the patients." Dr. Wickland then prescribed various cases, one of which was a young girl bent double. By his treatment, the obsessing spirit was driven out from the girl, and this spirit said, through Mrs. Wickland, that before passing over her back had been broken and she had been bent double. She had not realized that she was dead, but now that she had been released from her captivity, she went quietly away, and the girl was completely cured. Compare the above with the story in the 13th chapter of Luke's Gospel. Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and he saw in the congregation a woman bent double. The woman dared not come to him for healing because the law forbade it. It was the Sabbath. But Jesus was determined to heal her. So he called to her, "Woman, you are loosed from your infirmity." But his reassuring word was not enough to rouse the woman's faith. So he stepped down from the dais and laid his hands on her. And immediately she became erect and glorified God. In the presence of an admiring crowd, the president of the synagogue dared not rebuke Jesus for Sabbath breaking. So he meanly turned to the sufferers who were present, telling them that work, i.e. healing, must not be done on the Sabbath. "You hypocrites," said Jesus, referring to the president and other wretched Sabbatarians. "Does not each of you untether his ox or ass on the Sabbath and lead it away to drink? And ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, and much more than an animal, whom Satan hath bound, to have been loosed from her bondage on the Sabbath?" These appealing words put his opponents to shame, and all the crowd rejoiced over his splendid deed and courage. This was the third time that Jesus had dared publicly to break the Sabbath. Now the words, "whom Satan hath bound," do not imply that the woman was obsessed. She was not a lunatic. The case was therefore less difficult to deal with than the case of the lunatic lad previously referred to, or the case dealt with by Dr. Wickland. In this case, the magnetic power passing through the hands of Jesus was sufficient to unloose her from the satanic spirit. Dr. Luke says that a spirit caused her infirmity. Jesus says she was bound by Satan. Jesus believed in demonical possession, but he avoided the extreme and exaggerated Jewish view on the subject and made a distinction between ailments which were chiefly due to the process of physical law and those directly due to spirit agencies. His belief in demonical possession is not to be explained as a gracious accommodation to the views of the age. We find no gracious accommodation in his attitude towards the Sabbath. He deliberately broke the Sabbath, and he would have as deliberately opposed the views of the age on demonical possession had he not known, through his psychic faculty, that they were much more true than false. His courage in breaking the Sabbath can only be understood by those who know that, in the eyes of Rabbinism, the greatest offense was Sabbath breaking. All reformers have to break something. The massive mounds of religious materialism could not be broken up with a silver pickaxe. So Jesus used verbal dynamite and explosive actions in order to pulverize the impenetrable mass. Jesus had an intense reverence for a past that was all too small for him, and he had to break it up to the breaking of his own body in the greatest revolution the world has ever known. Would to God that his followers today had his sublime courage, and, deeming the past all too small for them, would rend it for truth's sake. Before facing his arch opponents at Jerusalem, Jesus again broke the Sabbath. He was not far from Herod's palace at Tiberias, and some Pharisees came to him and said, "You had better leave these parts. Herod means to kill you." Jesus replied, "Go and tell that fox that I will not be hurried by his cunning. I intend to go on casting out unclean spirits and healing until I complete my work in Jerusalem." What was it that gave Jesus such amazing courage? It was what we would call today his spiritualism. And by that, we should mean that he was in constant conscious contact with the unseen. Angels had ministered to him at the temptation. Moses and Elijah had spoken with him on the mount and urged and encouraged him to go through with his death. His psychic faculty had revealed to him that he must die and then return. No one has ever possessed more psychic gifts than Jesus. We are told that Swedenborg was, from childhood, clairvoyant and clairaudient, and we may be very sure that Jesus was. Indeed, he seems to have possessed the fullness of the psychic faculty. He walked with his head in the heavens while his feet were firmly set upon the earth. He was in the world but not of it, as all his followers should be. Another plot had been laid for him on his way to Jerusalem. He had accepted an invitation to dinner given by a ruler of the Pharisees. When he arrived, the Pharisees watched him closely. It was the Sabbath. And Dr. Luke says in his narrative, "Behold," i.e., note it, in front of him was a man who had dropsy. Jesus at once perceived the plot, and without waiting for the attack, he challenged them. "Is it right to heal on a Sabbath or not?" he asked. They had nothing to say. His constant exposure of Sabbatarian hypocrisy had begun to convince them almost against their will. In order to heal the man, Jesus took hold of him, and his magnetic touch cured him. Then, turning to those sleuth hounds who were watching him closely, Jesus said, "Which of you, if your son or even your ox fell into a well, would not pull him out at once upon the Sabbath day?" Now, the rabbis forbade such an action, though food might be let down. But Jesus was appealing to their common sense and humanity, and he evidently won his appeal, for they could not answer again unto such things. End of chapter. Don't go anywhere. We're going to continue to the next chapter. Before we do, go ahead, please, and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much. Chapter 18. 10 lepers by the wayside cried out to Jesus, "Master, have pity on us." The word master does not here mean teacher. It is a different Greek word, and it means one who has authority. These lepers had evidently heard of the wonderful works of Jesus and his ability to cleanse lepers. They therefore had faith in his power. But Jesus, through the exercise of his psychic faculty, knew that their faith was not yet strong enough for him to heal them. They needed to have their faith stimulated by action. So Jesus said to them, "Go and show yourselves to a priest," which was another way of saying, "You will be healed," for the priest was a sanitary inspector, and the law required that his certificate should establish the cure. As they went, their action stimulated and developed their faith to a pitch when healing became possible. They were healed, but in body only. 9 of them forgot to glorify God, or even to thank Jesus, which shows that their minds and spirits still needed to be made whole. One of the lepers, a Samaritan, hated by all Jews, did have the religious instinct and the common decency to glorify God and to thank Jesus. This so rejoiced the heart of Jesus that he said to the man, "Your faith has made you whole." He meant that he had healed in body, mind, and spirit. He cannot have meant that the man has been healed in body only, because the 9 irreligious and ungrateful lepers had also been healed in body. Mr. W. T. Parrish, in a letter he has written me, rejoices in the knowledge that some of those who have been healed through his healing ministry are being restored to the path that leads to God. All healing of the body should lead to the restoration of mind and spirit, but alas, too often it is taken as a matter of course. An ordinary medical practitioner may, I suppose, be a very clever doctor apart from having any religious faith. It does not therefore matter to him whether patients whom he heals are led nearer to God or not. But it matters everything to the consecrated spiritual healer, for being a spiritualist, he knows that progress in spiritual life is of all things the most important. He is therefore deeply grieved when a patient whose body has been healed shows little or no sign of restoration of mind and spirit. Not only did the 9 Jewish lepers who were healed fail to return thanks to God and Jesus, but the people of a Samaritan village failed likewise. For, in spite of the fact that 2 of his disciples had healed and cast out devils from these Samaritans, they refused Jesus' admission to their village. They had heard that he was on his way to the hated temple in the hated holy city. That was enough. They would have nothing to do with him. Notice here that these Samaritans had no personal antipathy to Jesus the healer, nor were they opposed to the wonderful works done among them by his disciples. But the fact that they thought he was going to visit the Jerusalem temple made it impossible for them to receive him. Had they only known. The irony of the situation is seen when one remembers that he was going to Jerusalem for the express purpose of breaking down forever the barriers of belief, tradition, and custom which separated Samaritan from Jew. Samaritans and Jews were so busy hating each other that they failed to recognize the mission, message, and unifying power of Jesus. It is even so today. The Orthodox religious world still clings so tenaciously to creed, custom, and tradition that it cannot appreciate the spiritual and psychical powers and the unifying work of the followers of Jesus who are called spiritualists. Spiritualism is as much opposed to religious materialism as to any other form of it. James and John were so angry with these Samaritans for refusing to receive Jesus that they asked him to give them power to call down fire from heaven to burn them up. James and John were psychical materialists, and in order to break down their materialism, Jesus told them frankly that they knew not what spirit they were of. And he added those beautiful words, which happily are preserved in a few manuscripts. The Son of Man is not come to destroy man's lives, but to save them, and told the story of the Good Samaritan. Throughout the journey to Jerusalem, he tried to make his disciples more spiritually minded. Jesus reached Jerusalem before the great feast of Tabernacles, a double feast of the Exodus and of the harvest, and remained after the multitudes had left. For many weeks he appeared in the temple facing rulers and people with his clear declaration that God had appointed and anointed him to teach and to perform wondrous works. One day he told them that those who acted up on his teaching would never die. He meant, of course, that they would not only survive physical death, but would possess the quality of life which is destined to endure forever. But the materially minded religious Jews interpreted the promise literally and said, "Now we know thou hast a devil. Abraham is dead, and so are all the prophets." "Abraham dead?" said Jesus. "Why, he rejoiced that he was to see my work on earth, and he has seen it." The Jews ridiculed the possibility of Jesus, who was under 50 years of age, being seen by Abraham. But Jesus explained to them that he was a very old soul and was in existence before Abraham was born. That was too much for them. They picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus concealed himself and made his way out of the temple. Orthodox traditionalists today believe in the pre-existence of Jesus. But that is only because they have been taught that Jesus was God. They do not believe in the pre-existence of anyone. And if anyone dares to suggest that immortality presupposes pre-existence, and that the explanation of much that perplexes us in this life may have to be sought in what happened in pre-existent states, he is deemed unorthodox quaint and queer. Wordsworth may sing, "Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar." But woe betide a bishop, priest, or deacon who maintains that this is scriptural. It does not seem to have occurred to the Orthodox that such a view is to be found in the teachings of Jesus, Paul, and the early fathers, and that the known facts of psychic science shed much revealing light upon such teachings. When I have hinted at this in the presence of Orthodox authorities, I have been met with, "Oh, then you are a theosophist," or "I suppose you believe in reincarnation." Anything to avoid the main issue. But we shall never get at the truth of things until men are trained to be willing and anxious to face truth at all cost, even the cost of orthodoxy. And so we ask, how did Jesus know that he was alive before Abraham was born? Who told Jeremiah that he was set apart before he was born? How could Paul have known that from the day of his birth he was chosen? They can only have known through the exercise of their psychic faculties. Curiously enough, the story of the man born blind follows immediately upon Jesus' declaration of pre-existence. And how can anyone explain the story apart from it? This is the story. After escaping from the stone throwers, Jesus saw a beggar who had been blind from birth. His disciples asked him whether the blindness was due to the man's sin or his parents. But how could it have been due to the man's sin? He had been blind from birth. Jesus did not, however, say, "What a quaint and queer question you are asking." On the contrary, he regarded the question as a perfectly natural one to ask. And he explained to them that this was a case of a man born blind in order to afford an opportunity for God to demonstrate his healing power in him. Neither for his own sin nor for his parents was he born blind. Again, how did Jesus know this? He must either have been told it clairaudiently or seen it clairvoyantly. I like to think of this beggar courageously consenting in his pre-existent state to be born blind in order to afford an opportunity for Jesus to manifest his healing power. And I like to think of Jesus courageously healing him on the Sabbath and telling the world that his blindness was not due to sin, but to sacrifice. Before Jesus healed the man, he said to his disciples, probably within the hearing of the man, "I am light for the world," not "I am the light of the world." The metaphor was suggested by the nature of the sign he was about to perform. And it signified that, while the power of his teaching could open the eyes of the mentally and spiritually blind, the power of his psychic endowment could give sight to the physically blind if they yielded themselves to his treatment. In this case, Jesus applied a mixture of clay and saliva to the man's eyes and told him to go and wash it off in the pool of Siloam. This he did and received his sight. End of chapter. We're going to move on to the next chapter in this video. I would like to ask, please hit the like button. And if you like what you see here, subscribe and come back often. All right, chapter 19. A leper whom Jesus had healed asked him to dinner. This took place during the Nazarene's last days on earth. The 12 apostles were invited too. After dinner, a woman came in and, with expensive perfume, anointed the feet of Jesus. Judas, the thief and betrayer, was very angry with her for wasting such valuable perfume and said that she ought to have sold it and given the money to the poor. Not that he cared for the poor, but because he carried the money box and pilfered what was put in. Jesus at once rebuked Judas, for he understood the beautiful motive behind the woman's action, and said, "Wheresoever the gospel shall be preached throughout the whole world, what she has done shall be told in memory of her." What a prophecy! Was it a rash prediction? Did Jesus really know that this act of love and generosity would be remembered from one generation to another and be written down in 3 books which would find their way to the ends of the earth? Did Jesus know that the story of his life would be written, and that the men who wrote the 1st, 2nd, and 4th Gospels would tell the story of this woman's action? How could anyone other than God himself have known them? Well, the plain fact is that this knowledge could have been revealed to Jesus in a perfectly natural, through supernormal way, through the exercise of his psychic gifts of clairvoyance, clairaudience, or prevision. These gifts were not unique in his case. Men have had them and exercised them from time immemorial. They have them today, as we shall see later. The day after the dinner, Jesus rode towards Jerusalem on an ass, and as soon as he came in sight of the city, his gift of prevision led him to make a remarkable prediction about the holy city. He said that a time was coming when enemies would besiege the city and the surrounding landscape be covered with Roman encampments. Jerusalem would be utterly destroyed and its inhabitants slain. 40 years later, the prediction was fulfilled. The Roman general Titus erected siege works round Jerusalem, and after the siege, the destruction of the city and its inhabitants was appalling. Jesus foretold the fall of Jerusalem 40 years before it came to pass. Archbishop Usher foretold the Irish rebellion 40 years before it came to pass, to the day. If anyone wishes to enlighten himself on this subject, he need only turn to the article on prediction in Dr. Fodor's Encyclopedia of Psychic Science. Lombroso, the famous Indian psychiatrist who died in 1909, tells of a Dr. C who predicted on the 4th February 1894 the burning of the Como exhibition. At the time of his prediction, even the building of the main edifice had not progressed very far. But so certain was the doctor that what he had predicted would come to pass that his family sold all their shares in the Milan Fire Insurance Company. The exhibition was destroyed by fire on the 6th July 1894. Dr. Osti writes in his book, Supernormal Faculties in Man, "A considerable number of persons have given me complete certitude that there are human beings who can predict. Of this, I have the same degree of certainty as of the existence of what we call the earth, the sun, the stars, minerals, plants, and animals." At the time of the persecution of the Huguenots, thousands of Protestants received the gift of prophecy. Marion and Lacy predicted 80 years in advance the division of France among the Roman Catholics, the Revolution, etc., etc. The American Civil War had many prophets. In 1860, in the Legislative Hall of Alabama, Mrs. Harding Britton became entranced and saw long lines of regiments and heard military music, the tramp of vast bodies of infantry, then wild agonizing shrieks and heart-rending groans. "Woe, woe to thee, Alabama," she cried out like the prophets of old, and predicted all the desolation and fearful suffering that later befell Alabama. D.D. Home, when at Dieppe in 1863, predicted the assassination of President Lincoln, which occurred in 1865. While looking in a crystal, he saw a crowd, and in it a man who had been assassinated and was in the act of falling from his chair. "That is Lincoln," said Home. Dr. Alfred Russell, Wallace's son, was told by one who had the gift of prevision that there would be an explosion in his laboratory in February or March and someone would be injured. The explosion took place on the 9th March. One of the students was seriously injured. Professor Reichert said, "If we knew the totality of things in the present, we should know the totality of things to come. Our ignorance of the future is the result of our ignorance of the present. If time is an illusion of the fleshy existence, our unknown powers may occasionally place us outside time and give us a glimpse of the accomplished future." But does not the idea of an accomplished future do away with free will? No. The seer sees the result of free choice. Spiritualism is quite familiar with the gifts of prevision and prediction. Its best mediums are constantly predicting events, often with astonishing accuracy. Most spiritualists who have, for any length of time, been investigating psychic phenomena have heard many predictions, some of which, if not at all, have been fulfilled. Cases have been known of spiritualists who have predicted not only the year of their passing, but the day and even the hour. In his newly published book, That Reminds Me, Ernest Outen tells of a Miss Grimshaw at whose house he attended a weekly circle. In December, she was taken ill. The doctor thought a few days would see the end. "I shall live to the end of March," she said. On the last Saturday in March, Outen went to see her. "I shall be leaving for the spirit world on Monday," she said. Outen told her that he would call and see her on Monday in the dinner hour. "If you are here before 1:30, I shall be here to greet you. If not, I will wrap you on Tuesday night," she replied. Outen arrived a few minutes after 1:30. She had passed away a quarter of an hour before. On Tuesday night, she kept her promise and gave her 3 heavy raps on 2 occasions during the evening. What I want to make clear is this: in no way does it belittle the psychic power and spiritual status of Jesus if sheer honesty compels us to admit that the same psychic powers, different in degree, but not in kind, have been wielded by multitudes of gifted ones. One of the predictions of Jesus was that his followers would do the works that he did, and greater. But if none of his followers possessed psychic powers, if signs did not follow them that believed, if no believer could do any of the works that Jesus did, we are tied up to this alternative. Either his predictions has proved untrue, or no one has ever believed in him. Now, it so happens that in the early days men did believe in him, and they did perform signs, as he said they would. Later on, alas, these signs, these proofs of the power of the Spirit subsided. And, as Harnack says, the morality of the followers of Jesus became adapted to a worldly life, and the church had its priests, its altars, its sacraments, its holy book, and the rule of faith, but it no longer possessed the Spirit and power. The opinion is sometimes advanced that Jesus attached but small importance to signs and wonders. We are told that he regarded them as bells to ring the people to church, and that he knew they would cease to ring when the people had assembled. There is not one word in the New Testament to support such a view. On the contrary, Jesus regarded signs and wonders not as bells, but as part of divine service. The mere fact that these signs, the works that I do, and greater works were to follow belief, shows that Jesus regarded them as inherent in his message as inherent as a watermark is in paper. They were more than hallmarks which might be removed or filled in or obliterated by time. They were actually part of the very substance of his message and of the church's life. The gospel of signs was and still is the sign of the gospel. If there were no signs today, it would be difficult to resist the conclusion that men had ceased to believe. Where there are no signs, men have ceased to believe. In spiritualism, there are signs and wonders because there is belief. End of chapter. Let's move on now to the next video. And before we do, hit that like button. And if there is something that you would like me to read here on the channel, leave me a comment on this video and I'll do my very best. Let's move on to the next video as we continue the reading of The Psychic Life of Jesus.